A new threat that both experts and politicians have been actively talking about during the last weeks. Russia could use chemical weapons in Ukraine. Such a scenario is allegedly being seriously considered in the Kremlin. Moreover, the information is not from Moscow. The West provides such intel data. How serious is the danger, what exactly can happen, and under what circumstances? My name is Oleksii Matsuka, and in this video we will talk about everything in detail. About the new threat chemical weapons and its possible use by Russia on the Ukrainian front, wrote the American publication Politico. Journalists referred to sources from the administration of the United States President. Those having assessed the threats came to the conclusion that Putin, before pressing the nuclear button, could use chemical weapons. Moreover, these are not conjectures and not assumptions. The newspaper wrote that 6 high-ranking American officials at once have such information.
But in the case of continued battlefield losses or a complete collapse of the Russian army, some top officials working on the issue have determined that Moscow might resort to employing chemical weapons, including those the country has been associated with using in the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. Quote from Politico.
We checked this information and heard from American officials there really is operational information about this. It does not suggest that an attack will occur in the coming days or weeks. On the contrary, the forecast is that with the onset of winter, hostilities will subside to some extent. But nevertheless, very different sources from intelligence data to Russian opposition activists are now talking that the Kremlin is discussing a scenario for using chemical weapons. And here, the first thing is to figure it out what chemicals can Russia use at all. What cruel weapon is there in the Russian arsenal? The Moscow officials claim that there are no chemical weapons in Russia at all. Back in 1993, the country joined a special convention according to which its development, production and use are prohibited. And in September 2017, they allegedly destroyed the rest of the chemical arsenal. Then, according to the official version, all 40,000 tons of Soviet stocks of dangerous chemicals were finally destroyed. But is it really so? After all, Russia has repeatedly found itself in the middle of scandals where chemical weapons figured as tools for revenge. The Soviet Union was armed with at least a dozen military poisonous substances. And these are just the ones that we know about. One of them is a nerve agent called Novichok, the one that poisoned the Skripal family in the United Kingdom in 2018. And 2 years later, the same poison, according to German experts, was used against the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. The consequences of poisoning with the Novichok are extremely difficult to treat. This poison has no taste or smell. Those who manage to survive suffer permanent organ and muscles damage afterwards. Another series of scandals is associated with the use of another poison, sarin. It was also in service with the USSR and later in Russia, and the Kremlin apparently provided it to the regime of the Syrian dictator Bashar Assad. According to the German Global Public Policy Institute, sarin was used there more than 300 times, most likely used in ammunition. The same General Surovikin led the Russian troops in Syria, so he could use the means that he considered effective there, experts are sure.
The Russian military leadership has been joined by people with experience in the use of chemical weapons in Syria. If Russia continues in this line and feels that it can increase the pressure by killing civilians, then it is quite logical that in such a perverted way the pressure will be increased even more. Mika Autola, director of the Finnish Foreign Policy Institute.
For skeptics who think that Russia is not capable of doing this, I can recall the situation with the storming of the Azovstal plant, during which, under the data of the US State Department, and this was announced openly in Washington, Moscow was all ready to use chemical weapons for conspiracy by mixing poison with the tear gas. That's what the State Department said back then.
We have reliable information that the Russians may have been preparing to use poisonous substances, potentially tear gas mixed with other poisonous substances, to weaken and incapacitate the Ukrainian military and civilians in Mariupol, to weaken the defense of the city. Ned Price, spokesman for the United States Department of State.
But chemical experts said then it's very important to develop a monitoring system in advance, because it's one thing to suspect Russia and another to collect evidence of the use of chemical weapons. This is not so simple as turns out. Same story now. If suddenly Moscow moves from threats to the implementation of its chemical plan, how can this be proved? Forensic experts will talk about the rules and protocols when it will be necessary to immediately collect samples of soil, water, tissues of dead animals, and immediately send them to laboratories in London or Washington. They cannot analyze the evidence everywhere. On the other hand, there are also assessments that in the situation of war, there is no time for forensic science, and it will be enough just objective data and political will. They recognize that Moscow once again went against all the rules, and to make it answer, at least with new sanctions.
Often this is the difficulty of accessing the scene of the incident, and often these are also political aspects. When half of the world signed the Chemical Weapons Convention, its use will set a great precedent. I think for the most part it's a political decision whether or not to recognize it. Maxim Dovhanovsky, hazardous substance accident response expert.
In Kyiv, the authorities say that they are aware of the situation. What is happening near the front line is being monitored. But so far they don't see the direct preparation of Russia for the use of such weapons.
They definitely have chemical weapons. They have radiological, biological, chemical protection units on the territory of Ukraine, which can use chemical weapons. But intelligence does not currently confirm that the Russians are massively transporting ammunition with poisonous substances. Oleksii Gromov, deputy head of the main operational department of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine.
But here another question arises. But what if information leaks in Moscow were deliberately allowed? What if this whole chemical weapons story is just a new part of the Kremlin plan? Now there are more and more suspicions that much of what Russia says and does is some sort of forcing to negotiations. The threats to use nuclear weapons or arrange tests over the Black Sea. What about strange statements about the dirty bomb, which both appeared out of the blue and disappeared from the agenda and from the information space of Russia? Then the shelling of Ukrainian energy facilities began, and Russia frankly declared this is their attempt to force both Ukraine and the West to agree to negotiation on Russia terms. Moreover, this was voiced at a meeting of the United Nations Security Council, which Ukraine asked to convene after the last massive shelling. And Justin Lidahol, on the record from Ambassador Nebenzia, it sounded, they say, either the missiles will fly further or start making concessions for Russia.
This special military operation will be implemented by military means until the Kyiv regime takes a realistic position, which would allow in the framework of negotiations to discuss and try to resolve the issues that forced us to launch this special military operation. Vasily Nebenzia, Ambassador of Russia to the UN.
Here, of course, it's worth understanding whether this is a pressure on the Ukrainian authorities or more the desire to show the West that the risks are supposed to increasing. But for a long time, to compress the spring, constantly raising stakes, increasing escalation is also impossible.
The Russian knot is tightened very tightly and turns into a Gordian knot, and every week, every month, the problems become more and more difficult. Most likely, some points will come, some banal event that will cut this Gordian knot. This must happen without fail. The only question is when exactly, under what circumstances, and with what consequences for Putin's elites, the entire Russian nation, and for Ukrainians in particular. Petro Chernik, military expert.
Kyiv has already stated that such a path to negotiations is considered unacceptable, especially after the new rocket attacks that caused a partial blackout in Ukraine.
I believe that Europe, together with the entire democratic world, should act more practically in relation to Russia. They demand negotiations from us. They demand the surrender of our state interests, realizing that we cannot follow this path at all. Oleksii Danilov, Secretary of the National Security Council of Ukraine.
There seems to be no more doubt that Moscow is asking for this conversation not for the sake of peace. And according to Western experts, the logic here is simple. During the negotiations, offer to declare a truce, albeit a temporary one, suspend hostilities, pull up reserves, use powers in order to gain a foothold in already occupied territories, and then, under any pretext, accuse Ukraine of violation of agreements and start offensive actions all over again, only after having already strengthened their grouping and completed the training of the newly mobilized.
The only thing a premature truce does is allow both sides to rearm, and since Russia is now the most exhausted, it will benefit the most from this, and then resume the war. So everything you buy for making a truce is the continuation of the war. It wouldn't solve any of the underlying problems. Michael Kaufman, Director of Russian Research at CNA Analyst Center.
It's also important to understand, each time information about a new threat appeared exactly after the failures of Russia at the conventional front, in particular after the start of the counteroffensive of the armed forces of Ukraine in the Kharkiv region. And the sources was not Russian officials, but the foreign press, to which there is more confidence in the world society. The Western intelligence received more numerous signals, and now all over again the same picture. So I do not rule out that the Kremlin simply took out another card from the deck of threats which they are trying very hard to play. How will it turn out? We'll see later. Now is such a time that nothing can be written off, and at the same time, not a single threat is capable of radically changing the situation by itself. And everything will continue to be decided on the battlefield, at the front line. Well, what exactly will happen? We will definitely talk about in one of the next videos. My name is Oleksii Matsuka. Thank you for watching and see you soon.